The moment Prince William stepped into the Queen's private chambers, the air inside Windsor changed. This was not a polite disagreement, not a quiet family correction, and not another palace misunderstanding hidden behind old curtains. It was a direct command, delivered with the force of inheritance, grief, and royal authority. Camilla was told to leave immediately, and everyone present understood that a private line had finally been crossed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William stopped at the doorway before he spoke. The prince looked not like a man entering another room, but like a grandson standing guard over the last untouched part of the Queen's world. Windsor Castle mattered because it was never just stone or ceremony. It was the emotional heart of the monarchy, where private grief and public duty had lived together for generations. The Queen's private chambers meant the rooms kept for her personal use, where papers, belongings, and final routines carried meaning beyond palace property. Camilla stood inside that space during a sensitive review of personal effects. Personal effects meant the late monarch's private belongings, the objects and papers that could reveal memory, preference, trust, and family feeling. William had been informed moments earlier that the Queen consort was there, and the message hit him with betrayal. He did not rush. He did not shout. He entered with a face so controlled it almost looked colder than anger. Camilla understood the change before the command came. She held her composure at first, but her expression tightened when the future king made clear this was not a request wrapped in royal manners. William ordered her out of Queen Elizabeth's private chambers immediately, in front of palace aides, after discovering she had entered without his approval. The words landed hard because the chamber was not neutral ground. It held the memory of the monarch who had shaped him, steadied him, and prepared him for the crown. A senior courtier closed a folder on the side table. That small movement said what no one dared say aloud. Something inside those rooms may have been too sensitive for Camilla to see. The Queen consort turned to leave, wounded but silent, and it seemed the confrontation might end there. Then she looked once toward the desk. William saw it. The prince did not miss the glance. And in that instant, the order became more than protection. It became suspicion. But before the palace could understand why William acted so sharply, it had to confront the painful truth about who had the most to lose inside that room. This was never only about a chamber. It was about a son guarding the memory of a grandmother, a queen consort defending her place, and a king caught between his wife and his heir. Behind that closed door stood years of unspoken resentment, careful smiles, and buried royal wounds. In one command, William exposed a battle the palace had spent years pretending it did not exist. William did not see the Queen's private chambers as another part of Windsor that could be opened, entered, and managed like any official room. To him, those rooms belonged to memory before they belonged to the monarchy. They held the last personal trace of Queen Elizabeth, the grandmother who had shaped his sense of duty long before the crown became his destiny. A private chamber, in royal terms, meant a deeply personal room reserved for the monarch's own use, not a public office or ceremonial space. That difference mattered because it separated service from intrusion, respect from ambition, and grief from control. Camilla saw the matter differently. As queen consort, the title given to the wife of the reigning king, she believed her position beside Charles carried dignity, recognition, and access to the spaces connected to the crown. She had spent years fighting for acceptance, enduring judgment, silence, and comparison. Now, standing inside a room once reserved for the late queen, Camilla felt that being asked to leave was not just a correction, it was humiliation. She kept her chin raised, but her hands tightened around her gloves, and that small act betrayed the wound she was trying to hide. William felt the weight of Elizabeth's trust pressing harder with every second. He stood near the writing desk and fought to keep his voice steady, because grief was sharpening every word before he could stop it. The prince knew that if he allowed this moment to pass quietly, the boundary would weaken forever. Camilla knew the room had shifted against her, and the queen consort understood that even her rank could not soften the judgment in his eyes. Charles was informed within minutes. That was when the silence became more alarming than any argument. The king did not immediately overrule William. He did not rush to defend Camilla. He simply absorbed the message, and his lack of action told the household that the prince's order carried more weight than anyone had expected. Then, a palace aide remembered something Elizabeth had once said in a documented household account. Her private rooms were not to become a battlefield for future claims. Suddenly, William's command felt less like anger and more like protection. And the question now became unavoidable. What past incident made him believe Camilla's presence inside those chambers was not innocent? To understand the command, the palace had to return to the earlier moment that quietly turned suspicion into certainty. Every royal rupture has a beginning, but this one began in a quieter way, not with shouting, not with scandal, but with a ceremony that ended in a private conversation no one was supposed to repeat. William had carried that memory for months. Camilla had dismissed it as harmless. Yet inside Windsor, that single moment became the trigger everyone later recognized as the true point of no return. William remembered the Windsor memorial reception with a heaviness he had never fully admitted. The gathering had been arranged to honor Queen Elizabeth after her passing, and a memorial reception meant a formal private event where family members and trusted figures came together to mark grief, legacy, and remembrance. It should have been a night of restraint. It should have belonged to memory. Instead, something shifted behind the polished language and careful smiles, because grief inside the monarchy never stayed simple for long. Camilla had spoken to a senior aide after the reception began to thin. She asked whether the Queen's personal letters and chamber inventory had been properly reviewed for future household use. Chamber inventory meant the recorded list of private items kept inside the monarch's personal rooms, from papers to belongings that could carry family meaning. To another person, the question might have sounded practical. To William, who overheard enough to understand the shape of it, the words felt cold. Future household use. Not memory. Not mourning. Use. William felt something inside him harden. The prince did not interrupt, but the sentence stayed with him. It made Elizabeth's belongings sound like property waiting to be sorted, not the remains of a life that had carried the crown through storms, wars, scandals, and silence. He knew royal households depended on order, but this sounded different. It sounded as if the Queen's private world was being quietly pulled into a contest before the family had even agreed to open it. Camilla later told Charles it had been a practical question. The Queen consort said she was thinking about household continuity, about responsibility, about avoiding confusion among staff. Charles listened, and the king wanted to believe her, because peace inside his home had become almost as important to him as peace inside the palace. But William heard the explanation differently. To him it sounded too smooth, too ready, too untouched by the pain that should have surrounded Elizabeth's name. Then came the note. A palace aide recorded the Windsor memorial reception exchange in a confidential household account, and confidential meant it was written for internal eyes only, not public debate. Days before William found Camilla inside the chambers, that account reached him. With that memory still fresh, William did not enter the room as a surprised grandson. He entered as a future king, convinced a boundary had been deliberately tested. And once he crossed the threshold, the palace witnessed the confrontation it had feared from the beginning. The chamber fell silent before William spoke. Camilla stood near the Queen's writing table, composed but not comfortable, while two aides froze between duty and fear. The prince did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The power of the moment came from how little he said, and how completely everyone understood it. Leave. Now. Not later. Not after explanation. Immediately. William had entered after a household official alerted him that Camilla was inside with access to personal items linked to Elizabeth's final years. A household official meant a senior palace worker trusted with private duties, not a public servant or distant observer. That mattered because the warning did not come through gossip. It came through the machinery of the palace itself, the same quiet system that had protected royal privacy for generations. So when the prince stepped in, he already knew the moment was dangerous. Camilla stood near items that were still waiting for review under family protocol. Protocol meant the agreed rules that decide who may enter, inspect, or handle private royal belongings before anything is moved or recorded. Those sealed boxes and marked letters were not ordinary papers. They belonged to the final chapter of the Queen's life, and for William, that made them sacred. He looked directly at Camilla and told her she had no permission to be there. His face stayed controlled, but grief sat behind every word. Camilla tried to answer with royal calm. She began carefully, as if dignity alone could rescue her from the humiliation of being corrected in front of aides. But her voice tightened when she realized William was not speaking as a nephew by marriage. He was speaking as the guardian of the monarchy's future. The Queen consort had spent years building her place beside Charles, And now, in one brutal exchange, that place seemed to stop at the edge of Elizabeth's desk. A chair scraped softly as one aide stepped back. The sound cut through the room like a warning, and even Camilla stopped arguing for a moment. William placed one hand on the Queen's desk and made the boundary final. The chambers were not to be entered again without direct approval from him and Charles together. Charles was not there, yet the King's name carried weight, because William knew this decision could not survive as emotion alone. It had to stand as authority. Camilla left with her pride wounded and her silence heavy. William watched her pass the doorway, believing the worst of the confrontation had ended. Then a courtier glanced toward the visible stack of papers and froze. A small envelope was no longer where it had been. No one spoke at first, but everyone understood what that absence could mean. That missing envelope turned a family confrontation into a question of power, permission, and control inside the royal household. A royal order only matters when power stands behind it. Inside Windsor, the question was immediate and dangerous. Did William have the right to command Camilla out, or had he crossed a line of his own? The answer came not from loud declarations, but from a quiet file, a locked cabinet, and Charles reading a sentence that made him set the paper down without speaking. Charles received the file after the chamber had already become the most dangerous room in the palace. He knew this was no longer just a family wound. It had become a test of authority. Palace officials had begun reviewing the private chamber protocol created after Queen Elizabeth's passing, and protocol meant the written rules, deciding who could enter, inspect, record, or move personal royal belongings. That mattered, because the monarchy survives on control. If one private space could be entered without approval, then every protected boundary around the late Queen's memory could begin to weaken. William's command suddenly looked different on paper. The document placed final discretion with Charles and William whenever personal items related to Elizabeth's private correspondence or dynastic legacy. Dynastic legacy meant the matters connected to the future of the royal line, the family's authority, and the inheritance of duty from one generation to the next. So this was not simply about letters, boxes, or one uncomfortable confrontation. It was about who had the right to protect the Queen's final private world from becoming a place of influence. Charles read the sentence alone. The king lowered the page slowly, and for a moment, even his loyalty to Camilla could not erase what was written in front of him. William had not acted from reckless emotion alone. The prince had acted from authority that already existed, authority Charles had allowed because he knew his heir would one day carry the weight of these decisions. That truth hurt him. It left the monarch trapped between defending his wife and admitting his son had followed the rules. Camilla felt the betrayal before anyone explained it fully. She learned Charles had not immediately challenged William, and her hurt turned colder than anger. The queen consort had expected protection, or at least hesitation. Instead, she found silence. That silence told her that the room, the file, and perhaps even the king himself had moved beyond her reach. Then the palace secretary confirmed the detail no one could ignore. Camilla's visit had not been entered into the official chamber access log, the record used to track who entered restricted royal spaces and when. The missing envelope was also identified as part of a bundle linked to Elizabeth's private notes on household boundaries. Suddenly, the fear was sharper. Someone had searched too close to something too specific. With the protocol now against her, Camilla's removal became official, and the first consequences began before sunset. By evening, the palace was no longer asking whether William had acted too harshly, but what Camilla's removal would cost everyone around her. The first fallout did not arrive with headlines. It arrived in a quiet room where Camilla sat alone, her gloves still in her lap, staring at a message that confirmed what she had feared. Her access had been suspended. Her presence in the Queen's private chambers would now require approval. And for the first time since becoming Queen Consort, she felt the palace door close from the inside. Camilla read the notice once, then read it again, as if the words might soften the second time. They did not. The household office had sent the formal restriction, and the household office meant the part of the palace machine that manages private royal arrangements, staff instructions, and internal permissions. That mattered because this was not a passing insult from William. It had now moved into the structure of the monarchy, where private hurt becomes official reality. Her staff received instructions almost immediately. They were not to request chamber entry, remove items, or arrange any inspection of Elizabeth's private rooms without written clearance. Written clearance meant direct permission that could be recorded and traced, making every future request visible. For Camilla, that detail cut deeply. She was not only being blocked from a room, she was being watched at the door of a memory that everyone else now treated as dangerous ground. Camilla placed the notice flat on the table. She did not lash out. She did not demand an audience in that first moment. Her silence revealed more than anger ever could. The queen consort had survived public judgment before, but this was different, because the wound had come from inside the family, from the future king, and from a space tied to Elizabeth's final dignity. Her title still remained, but the authority around it had suddenly narrowed. Charles came to her later, and the distance between them felt heavier than any argument. The king wanted peace. He wanted the palace to breathe again. He wanted William's anger contained and Camilla's humiliation soothed before the story escaped. But Camilla wanted more than comfort. She wanted protection. She wanted Charles to make clear that William had wounded her publicly, and that such a wound could not simply be buried beneath royal calm. William received his own message before the evening settled. A palace aide told the prince that Camilla's team had asked whether the chamber restriction also applied to correspondence linked to Charles. That question exposed another layer of concern, because it suggested the search for access might not have been over. Then came the strange relief that did not feel like relief at all. The missing envelope was found in the wrong tray. Not stolen, moved. And to William, that was enough. It proved the room had been searched too freely, handled too carelessly, opened too soon. The crisis now forced William and Charles into a private meeting with no aides, no buffers, and no room left for polite avoidance. When father and son finally faced each other, the argument shifted from Camilla's access to the future shape of the crown itself. No officials stood between them. No private secretary softened the words. Charles and William met alone, and the silence at first said more than either man dared. One was a king trying to hold a marriage, a monarchy, and a memory together. The other was a son, a grandson, and a future sovereign who believed the crown could not survive if sacred boundaries became negotiable. Charles asked the question with the weight of a father and the caution of a monarch. Why did the chamber order have to be so immediate, so public, and so impossible to reverse? A chamber order meant the direct instruction that removed Camilla from Elizabeth's private rooms and placed future access under control. That mattered because it was no longer only about one painful exchange. It had become a signal to the whole royal household that William's authority could now challenge even the queen consort when legacy was at stake. William did not answer quickly. The prince knew every word would either deepen the wound or define the future. He told Charles the issue was not Camilla alone. It was the principle behind the door. Elizabeth's private world could not become a political space inside the palace, and political space meant any room or object used to shape influence, position, or future power. For William, that was the danger. Once grief became strategy, nothing sacred would remain untouched. Charles looked wounded when William said the monarchy had already paid too high a price for confusing personal loyalty with institutional duty. The king understood the accusation beneath the words, even though his son did not say it cruelly. Charles had spent years protecting Camilla from judgment, but now he was being asked to protect Elizabeth's memory from any hint of ambition. The cost was brutal, because both loyalties were personal. Both loyalties hurt. William softened only once. He admitted he had acted from grief as much as authority. The queen had not been just a sovereign to him. She had been the steady hand behind his future, the woman whose silence often taught more than speeches ever could. But the prince refused to apologize for protecting her rooms. He would not turn duty into regret simply because the truth had embarrassed someone powerful. Then Charles revealed the sentence that changed everything. Elizabeth had left verbal instructions, shared in a recorded private conversation with a senior household aide, that certain private chambers should remain untouched by ambition. Verbal instructions meant spoken wishes rather than a signed order, but inside the family, those words carried moral force. William heard them and understood that his instinct had not been wrong. The prince agreed to keep the matter from becoming a formal accusation, but only if the chamber restrictions stayed permanently. Charles accepted. Not happily, not easily, but he accepted. And with that acceptance, the palace prepared for the public story it could no longer fully contain. By morning, Windsor's private rupture had escaped into the public world, where one image turned royal tension into national judgment. The monarchy can hide many things, but it cannot always hide the meaning of a closed door. By sunrise, the country was not reading a dry palace statement. It was staring at a front page that captured the whole rupture in one brutal image. Camilla leaving Windsor under a black umbrella, William standing behind the glass, and the headline declaring that the Queen's rooms had become the monarchy's new fault line. William saw the coverage before the palace had finished deciding how to respond. He did not speak at first, because the story had already moved beyond private pain. A major Sunday newspaper had placed the moment on its front page, and a front page meant the most important public story of the day, the one editors believed would shape national conversation. That mattered because the chamber order was no longer contained inside Windsor. It had become a symbol. People were no longer asking only what Camilla had done, they were asking what William had defended. Camilla saw the same image and looked away before anyone finished reading the headline aloud. The Queen Consort had endured public judgment before, but this felt different. Palace rank could shield her from official disrespect, yet it could not protect her from the emotional meaning the country had already attached to the photograph. To many, she was not simply leaving a castle. She was leaving a space that still belonged, in the public heart, to Elizabeth. Broadcasters moved quickly. One presenter framed the story as a battle over legacy, not property, and that word mattered. Legacy meant what a monarch leaves behind beyond jewels, rooms, and records the trust, discipline, and emotional authority that survive after death. The coverage focused on Elizabeth's memory and William's rising authority, turning a household restriction into something larger. Suddenly, the future king looked less like an angry son, and more like a protector drawing a hard line. William watched in silence, frustrated that a private act of protection had become a national spectacle. He had wanted control, not applause. He had wanted boundaries, not headlines. Yet the public mood was already shifting. Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd gathered near the gates, some holding flowers for Elizabeth. Windsor Castle, the royal residence long tied to national memory, became the place where grief found a voice again. The crowd did not need speeches. Their presence said enough. Then one broadcaster gave the phrase that spread everywhere. The day the future king defended the past. It was simple. It was sharp. It turned the image into a verdict before the palace could craft one of its own. Camilla felt exposed. Charles felt cornered. William felt the weight of being understood too loudly and too soon. With the nation now watching, the palace had to decide what emotional truth it would allow to stand as the final meaning of the order. In the end, the verdict did not come from statements or protocol, it came from what each person accepted after the door had closed. The order that began as a shock ended as a verdict. William did not remove Camilla simply from a room. He removed uncertainty from a boundary the palace had avoided naming. Charles did not win or lose in public, but he accepted what the crown required. Camilla did not vanish from royal life, but she learned that some spaces cannot be entered through title alone. And Elizabeth's memory stood untouched. William returned to the chamber after the noise had faded, and this time, anger no longer led him. The prince carried the moved envelope back to the papers where it belonged, and the simple act felt heavier than any speech. The chamber restriction remained in place, and that restriction meant a permanent rule limiting who could enter the Queen's private rooms or handle her personal effects. It mattered because those rooms were no longer treated as ordinary royal property. They became protected ground, guarded not by ceremony, but by memory, trust, and the pain of what had almost been crossed. Camilla accepted the decision without another confrontation. The Queen Consort still stood beside Charles at the next family gathering, but her silence told its own story. She had not been stripped of her role, yet she had been reminded that rank did not open every door. Charles felt that silence beside him, and the king understood the cost. He had protected peace by accepting a wound. He had protected the crown by allowing his wife to feel its limits. Palace officials treated the decision as a family matter settled internally, but no one inside Windsor misunderstood what had changed. Officials in this setting meant the senior people responsible for managing the royal household and keeping private matters controlled. Their quiet acceptance mattered, because it showed William's authority had visibly strengthened. The future king had not raised his voice to seize power. He had drawn a boundary, and the palace obeyed it. Charles privately told William, through a documented household account later preserved by a senior aide, that protecting the crown sometimes means hurting the people closest to it. The words did not heal everything, but they confirmed the king understood the sacrifice. William listened, and the prince did not celebrate. He simply accepted that duty had once again demanded pain before peace. The final meaning became impossible to ignore. The Queen's private chambers were not merely rooms. They were the last protected symbol of Elizabeth's trust, discipline, and personal reign. This moment proved that William's future kingship would not be built only on inheritance, but on boundaries, and that Camilla's role, however powerful, would never outrank the monarchy's deepest memory. The door closed, the order stood, and Windsor understood that the past had been defended by the man destined to carry the crown forward. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.